There is a word in the J's manuscript of the Book of Enoch that appears exactly twice in the entire text. 2 times across the full length of one of the most complex and detailed sacred texts produced in the ancient world. The word appears once in chapter 14, in the passage where Enoch describes the throne of God and the beings who carry it, and it appears once more in chapters 17 through 19, in the passage where Enoch describes the sealed structure beneath the ocean floor containing beings that God chose to contain rather than destroy. The same word, in 2 passages that the Western scholarly tradition has never placed in direct conversation with each other because they are cataloged under different thematic headings in every academic edition of Enoch ever produced. One passage is classified as throne mysticism. The other is classified as cosmological geography. Different categories, different chapters, different research traditions, the same word, and the word, in the GE's manuscript tradition, means something that no standard English translation of either passage has rendered with sufficient precision. It means something that is held in position not by physical force, but by an agreement made before the physical world existed. Something that is not chained, not imprisoned, not confined, held. By a prior arrangement that precedes the existence of the thing being held and precedes the existence of the structure doing the holding. When you place the 2 passages that share this word side by side and read them together the way they were apparently meant to be read, what emerges is not 2 separate descriptions of 2 separate things. It is one description of a single system, a system in which what sits beneath the throne of God and what is sealed beneath the ocean floor are connected by the same prior arrangement, the same holding mechanism, the same word, and the Western Church has never allowed the people sitting in its pews to read either passage in full. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed the Book of Enoch from Christian scripture. The stated reason was content describing the structure of heaven in ways reserved for God alone. But the private correspondence of Jerome, compiled while he was assembling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE and partially preserved in the archive of the Vatican Apostolic Library, contains a letter to a fellow scholar in which Jerome describes the specific passages that generated the most concern among the bishops at Laodicea. He names 2. The first is the ocean floor prison passage, chapters 17 through 19 of the Book of the Watchers. The second is the throne passage from chapter 14. Jerome's concern in that letter is not with either passage individually. His concern is with what he calls their conjunction. The word he uses in the Latin is conjunctio, meaning a joining, a meeting point, a place where 2 things that appear separate reveal themselves to be connected. Jerome had read the GES closely enough, or had access to scholarly commentary closely enough, to understand that chapters 14 and 17 through 19 were not 2 separate passages about 2 separate subjects. They were 2 windows into the same underlying structure, and he found that conjunction more troubling than either passage alone. The letter does not explain why. Jerome records his concern and moves on, but the fact of the concern is itself significant. The man who shaped the Bible that dominated Western Christianity for 1,000 years read these 2 passages together, identified a connection between them that he called a conjunction, and then ensured that neither passage reached the general Christian public in the form that would make the conjunction visible. Chapter 14 of the Book of Enoch is one of the oldest pieces of Jewish mystical literature that survives in any form. Scholars who study the tradition called Merkabah mysticism, the mysticism of the divine chariot or throne, identify Enoch 14 as a foundational text for the entire tradition. The chapter describes Enoch being taken into the presence of the divine throne. The description begins with the outer structure, moves inward through successive barriers of fire and crystal and cold, and eventually reaches the throne itself. The throne passage in chapter 14 is the passage most commonly discussed in academic literature on Enoch. What is less commonly discussed, and what standard Western translations handle with notable brevity, is what the text says about what is beneath the throne. Not beside it, not surrounding it. Beneath it, the GES manuscript at Aksum devotes 11 verses to the description of the 4 beings who carry the throne from below. 11 verses, the standard R.H. Charles translation of 1906, which remains the most commonly cited English edition in popular literature, gives these beings 3 sentences. 3 sentences for 11 verses. The compression is not accidental. What the 11 verses contain, when read against the full Ge'ez manuscript tradition, rather than the abbreviated Western editions, is a description of 4 distinct beings, each one different from the others, each one carrying a different aspect of the throne's weight, and each one connected to a different domain of what Enoch's cosmology calls the foundational architecture of the created world. The first being is described in terms that have a partial parallel in Ezekiel's vision of the cherubim. 4 faces, wings, a form that is both singular and multiple. The Ge'ez uses language that overlaps with Ezekiel enough that scholars who read only the Western tradition assume Enoch is simply elaborating on Ezekiel. But the Ge'ez manuscript contains details in this description that do not appear in Ezekiel, and that have no parallel in any other canonical text. The first being's face that faces downward toward the ground beneath the throne is described as different from its other 3 faces. Not in number of eyes or in species of animal, different in quality. The Ge'ez word used for this downward face implies a face that is engaged in a form of perception directed specifically at what lies below rather than around or above. The first being does not merely carry the throne. Its downward face is actively attending to something beneath the throne. Something below the level of the throne, beneath the level of the beings who carry it, in the direction of the world below. The text does not name what the downward face is attending to. It records the attention without specifying its object. And then it moves to the second being. The second being beneath the throne is described in terms that have no parallel in Ezekiel or in any other canonical vision text. The Ge'ez uses a construction that implies a form that is partly within the visible structure of the throne assembly and partly extending downward through the floor of the heavenly space into a layer below, not standing on the floor, passing through it. The second being's lower half is described as extending into a space beneath the floor of the divine assembly chamber that the text does not otherwise identify or describe. It is present in the throne assembly and simultaneously present in something below the throne assembly. The Ge'ez word for its lower half in this configuration is a form of a root that appears elsewhere in the manuscript to describe a root system. Something that extends downward from a visible structure into a medium that supports and sustains the visible structure from below. The second being is not just carrying the throne. It is connecting the throne to something beneath it. It is the link between what is visible in the divine assembly and whatever exists in the layer the text places below the floor of that assembly. And then comes the third being, which the Ge'ez describes with more brevity than the first 2, but with a detail that is unique in the entire Enochic text. The third being carries its portion of the throne's weight in silence. Not because it is silent by nature, the text specifies that the other 3 beings produce sound, each one a different sound, described in terms that suggest continuous and purposeful auditory activity. The third being produces no sound. The Ge'ez word used implies not the absence of sound, but the active withholding of it. The third being is capable of sound and is choosing not to make it. The text records this detail without commentary or explanation. The sound it is withholding. The text does not say the reason for the withholding. The text does not say. Only that the third being carries its portion of the throne in deliberate and active silence, while the other 3 produce their separate and continuous sounds. And then comes the fourth being. The fourth being is where the word appears. The word that appears only twice in the entire Ge'ez text of Enoch. The word that connects chapter 14 to chapters 17 through 19 in a way that Jerome identified as a conjunction and then ensured would not reach ordinary Christian readers. The fourth being beneath the throne is described as carrying something in addition to its portion of the throne's weight. The Ge'ez specifies that the fourth being holds, in addition to the throne above it, something that exists below it, in the layer beneath the throne assembly floor, in the space that the second being's lower half extends into. The fourth being is simultaneously a support for the throne above and a holder of something below. And the word used for what it holds below is the word that appears only one other time in the entire Ge'ez Enoch. The word used in chapters 17 through 19 for what the sealed structure beneath the ocean floor contains. The same word for the same holding relationship, the same prior arrangement, the same mechanism of holding that is not physical force but a pre-creational agreement. The fourth being beneath the throne of God holds, From above, the same category of thing that the sealed structure beneath the ocean floor holds, from below. They are not the same beings. The text is clear that what is beneath the throne and what is beneath the ocean are different populations in different conditions for different reasons. But the holding mechanism is the same. The word is the same. And when you understand what the word means, the architecture of the entire system becomes visible in a way that neither passage makes visible on its own. Dr. Michael Knibb of King's College London, whose 1978 Oxford translation of Enoch remains the standard scholarly English edition for academic use, addressed the fourth being passage in chapter 14 in a single footnote. The footnote describes the passage as containing vocabulary of uncertain provenance that may reflect later scribal elaboration. Uncertain provenance. The diplomatic language of a scholar who has identified something significant and chosen not to pursue it in print. Dr. Knibb was working from the Ge'ez manuscript tradition and from the partial Qumran materials available to him at the time. He read the fourth being passage. He identified the unusual vocabulary. He wrote a footnote and moved on. What the footnote does not mention is the second occurrence of the same vocabulary in the ocean floor passage. Whether Knibb made the connection and chose not to note it, or whether the organizational separation of the two passages in the scholarly literature prevented him from seeing the parallel. The footnote records uncertain provenance, and nothing more. The connection between chapter 14 and chapters 17 through 19 has not appeared in any published academic treatment of Enoch since Knibb's 1978 edition. It is not that scholars have examined it and found it unimportant. It is that the two passages belong to different research programs, are discussed in different volumes, and are read by scholars whose specializations do not typically require them to read across the full Ge'ez text in the way that would make the parallel visible. The Qumran material complicates and enriches the picture. Fragment the fourth quarter of 24 contains Aramaic text from the Book of the Watchers, including portions of the ocean floor passage. Fragment the fourth quarter of 21 contains Aramaic text from an earlier section of the Watchers material that includes a partial version of the approach to the throne in chapter 14. The two fragments are stored in the same institution, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but they are cataloged and studied as part of different research clusters. The vocabulary parallel between the fourth being passage and the ocean floor passage exists in the Ge'ez with sufficient clarity that Dr. Ephraim Isaac flagged it in a private research note that was later referenced in a 2004 paper by Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Stuckenbruck's paper is about the Book of Giants and addresses the Enoch material only tangentially. The reference to Isaac's research note appears in a subordinate clause in a footnote on page 47. It reads, Isaac has noted in unpublished materials a possible lexical connection between the fourth carrier passage of chapter 14 and the containment language of the Watcher's cosmology, which awaits fuller investigation. In a footnote, in a paper about a different text, published in 2004, the fuller investigation has not been published in the 20 years since that footnote appeared. The access problem is layered here in a way that is worth tracing carefully. The Ge'ez manuscripts at Aksum, which contain the fullest version of both passages, and which would allow a researcher to confirm and analyze the vocabulary parallel in its most complete form, have been inaccessible to Western scholars since 1974. The photographic copies made before 1974 and held at the Oriental Institute in Oxford contain both passages, but requests for access to the chapter 14 photographs specifically have encountered the same additional authorization requirement that has blocked access to the chapter 39 photographs. In the Heaven Layers study, the Qumran fragments that contain partial versions of the relevant Aramaic text are accessible at the Israel Museum, but in the organizational structure of the Dead Sea Scroll Publication Project. The chapter 14 material and the chapter 17 through 19 material were assigned to different editors, published in different volumes, and cross-referenced with each other only at the level of general thematic index entries that do not flag the specific vocabulary parallel. A researcher who knew to look for the parallel could find it by reading across the published editions. A researcher who did not already know to look for it would not find it by following the organizational logic of the publication project. The parallel is visible in the text. It is invisible in the scholarly apparatus built around the text. What the parallel means. When you follow it to its conclusion, is this: the holding mechanism described in Enoch is not a response to two separate events requiring two separate responses. It is a single system with two anchor points. The throne of God above and the sealed structure beneath the ocean below are connected by a prior arrangement made before the physical world existed that established a holding relationship between what is above and what is below. The fourth being beneath the throne holds from above what the ocean floor structure holds from below. Not in the sense that they are holding the same beings, in the sense that they are both expressions of the same holding mechanism, the same pre-creational agreement, operating simultaneously at the top and the bottom of the created structure. The created world exists between two holding points. Above it, beneath the throne, the fourth being maintains its portion of the pre-creational arrangement in active and continuous operation. Below it, beneath the ocean floor, the sealed structure maintains its portion of the same arrangement in sealed and permanent condition. The world that human beings inhabit is suspended between these two expressions of a single system whose design predates the world's existence. The theological implications of this architecture are precisely what Jerome identified as the conjunction worth suppressing. A world suspended between two holding points of a pre-creational arrangement is a world that exists within a system rather than simply beneath a creator. The distinction matters institutionally because a system has its own logic, its own conditions, its own structure that exists independently of any particular relationship between creator and creature. A church that tells its members they exist in a direct relationship with a creator, mediated by the church's sacramental authority, is operating in a different framework than a text that places human existence within a pre-creational system that was designed before humans existed, and that operates according to a prior arrangement to which humans are not party. The first framework gives the institutional church a specific and necessary role. The second framework places the institutional church inside a larger structure that the church itself did not design, does not control, and cannot fully describe because the full description has been locked in Jez manuscripts in Aksum since 1974, and in a private research note by Ephraim Isaac that has been waiting for fuller investigation since before it was mentioned in a footnote in 2004. There is one more element to this that the available scholarship does not address. The third being the one that carries its portion of the throne in deliberate and active silence while the other three produce their separate sounds. The text specifies that the first being's sound relates to its function of attending to what is below. The text specifies that the second being's sound relates to its function of connecting the throne to the layer beneath the assembly floor. The text specifies that the fourth being's sound relates to its function of holding the pre-creational arrangement from above. Three sounds, three functions, three descriptions of what the sounds are for, and the third being has no sound. Not because it has no function, the text gives the third being a function, the carrying of its portion of the throne's weight, the same as the others, but the sound that would correspond to that function. The third being is actively withholding. What sound it is capable of. The text does not say. What the withholding accomplishes. The text does not say. Only that it is deliberate, that it is active, and that it exists in the context of a system where the other three components are producing sounds that correspond to their functions in the pre-creational arrangement. The third being's silence is not an absence. It is a choice, or a condition, or a requirement, and the text records it without explaining it with the same restraint it uses when Michael goes silent in the fourth layer of heaven. A restraint that is itself a form of information. Something is being withheld. The text marks the withholding without filling it, and the mark it leaves is the silence of the third being, carrying its portion of the oldest arrangement described in the Enochic tradition, making no sound while the world that exists between the throne above and the seal below continues its history in the space between two holding points, whose connection was established before the world that occupies that space was made. The Jez manuscripts are in Aksum. The photographic copies are in Oxford. The Qumran fragments are in Jerusalem. The research note by Ephraim Isaac that identified the vocabulary parallel is unpublished, referenced only in a subordinate clause in a footnote in a paper about a different text. Waiting since 2004 for the fuller investigation its author never completed. The fourth being beneath the throne is still carrying its portion of the pre-creational arrangement from above. The sealed structure beneath the ocean floor is still holding its portion of the same arrangement from below. The world continues to exist in the space between them, in a system whose full description has not been available to Western scholarship in over 50 years. In a text that Jerome read and called a conjunction too dangerous to circulate, in passages that 32 bishops at Laodicea voted to remove from the Bible in 364 CE, without saying they were false, only that they were excessive, only that they described too much, only that the knowledge of how the created world is held in position, and by what and under what prior arrangement made before the world existed, was not knowledge that ordinary Christians were meant to carry. The third being is still silent. The sound it is withholding has not been heard in any text that Western scholars have been permitted to read. And somewhere in the fuller investigation that has been waiting since 2004, in the unpublished research note that identified the connection, in the Ge'ez manuscript pages that have not been examined by a Western scholar since before 1974, is whatever Enoch wrote about what the third being's silence means for the system it is part of. The word that connects the throne to the ocean floor appears twice in the full Ge'ez text of Enoch. It has not appeared once in any Bible the Western Church has ever produced. And the architecture it describes, the pre-creational system of holding that suspends the created world between two anchor points, has been sitting in ancient ink on aged parchment in a stone church in Ethiopia, saying what it has always said, waiting for the conjunction Jerome identified to be followed to the place he was afraid it led.